Hi everyone, it's fantastic to be here and to be here with James. I'm not going to bore you telling you about what I do, but really this is a platform for James to inspire you the way he does me in our work as businesses and social enterprises operating both in the UK and on the African continent. So, I mean, I suppose, James, you're somebody who's spent the last 20 years advising policymakers, businesses, investors on how to optimize Africa's growth and development. And you're now running a climate ventures business and championing climate action on the African continent. This is a day on the UK green transition and an audience of people primarily focused on that question. Why are we having a session on Africa at all? And what do you see when you think out over the next 20 years in Africa? And why should this audience be paying attention to that?
Thanks, Nicola. Always a privilege to share a stage with you, and given your own work on the question of jobs in general, I think there'll be a lot for us to kind of engage and discuss. I think where I'll start is just be clear that this is not a conversation, and it's not going to be a conversation about how all of us, in addition to helping the UK solve its green jobs challenges, also need to maybe help out Africa. That's not the discussion. There's a moral case for it. That's not the case I'm here to make. The case I'm here to make is a pure, hard-nosed realist one that says if we are to avoid climate disaster, the Paris Agreement, the IPCC reports, everything is very clear that humanity needs to undertake three massive tasks. We need to protect and ideally restore the few still functioning natural carbon sinks that the planet has, many of them concentrated in the tropics. We need to decarbonize every aspect of human production and consumption today. So take every industry and find a way to squeeze out emissions from it, largely by shifting to electrification and renewable energy and new approaches. And then finally, people usually stop at those first two, but those are actually no longer going to be enough. We are going to find some way to be removing between 5 and 15 billion tons of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere every year, over and above what our existing natural carbon sinks are doing today, right? Just to give you a sense, that quantum of tonnage of carbon removal in different ways is about the size of the global fossil fuel industry today. It's an industry that does not exist. And I think our conversations tend to cut off at the point of how do we stop making climate change worse, which is shift to renewables now, avoid additional unnecessary emissions, and so on. And of course, if you just stop there, there's a whole lot of jobs that exist today that are going to go away. But we're going to need a whole lot of new stewards of nature. We're going to need a whole lot of innovation in decarbonizing everything we do. And then there's an entire massive new sector that's going to be intensive in its usage of land, natural resources, energy, that is truly existential for us as a species. Now, for all of that, Africa brings, for the remainder of the century, the world's largest workforce, massive endowments of land and natural resources. I'm not just talking about critical minerals. The minute you say natural resources in Africa, everyone immediately says, yes, 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 the cobalt. But it's not just the cobalt. It's the biodiversity. It's the coastlines. It's the tropical landmass, which is important for a whole range of reasons. It's a subterranean basalt, if you're thinking of geologically storing carbon at any sort of scale. And then finally, it's the super abundant, like the truly mind-boggling abundance of untapped renewable energy in the tropical belt of the planet. The number I like to share is 50x. If you take the projected global electricity demand of 2040, not today, of 2040, Africa alone could generate 50 times that with its renewable energy potential. So in a world where we're going to need to turn all of that energy into these three imperatives, ignoring Africa and ignoring how you work with Africa is kind of writing yourself out of the story of how the planet is going to get to net zero.
Thank you. Okay, so now we have everyone's attention. I mean, what do you see as the opportunities? Where are the big opportunities? What's the growth going to look like? I mean, there tends to be a big focus on the big risks. You know, the working age, huge population of young Africans, you know, people can kind of feel overwhelmed by that idea. It's like, you know, is that going to cause waves of migration? Is it going to cause, you know, there's a lot of focus on the risk. What do you see as the big opportunities? What is that growth going to look like on the African continent? What is the jobs-rich growth going to look like? Paint that picture for us to 2050.
So if we're going to look out to 2050, the first thing I'm going to try and do is disabuse us of the fallacy of small expectations, right? If we try and solve this problem small, we're going to fail big. The way I'll do that is first anchor the conversation a little bit, right? Let's go back to 1980. And let's go to a small town, almost a village of 30,000 people called Shenzhen. If you'd gone to that place in 1980 and said, this is going to be the center of global manufacturing, within the professional lifetime of people still sitting in this room, you'd have been committed to an insane asylum, right? But it happened because of a whole range of forces, particularly the process of turning a large labor force into a very competent industrial workforce. I'm just using that as an anchor for where we start. Because where we need to go is to start saying, where are the efficiencies if we're going to have to decarbonize everything, right? So let's take as a given that we all understand that conservation and restoration of nature is something that Africa is actually well suited to do. And I'm saying Africa, but I'm really talking about the global south. Because when we say global south, it's actually a geographically illiterate term. What we really mean is the tropics. We don't mean Australia and New Zealand. We mean the tropics, right? So we mean much of Latin America, much of Southeast Asia, and mostly sub-Saharan Africa, right? So that's the battlefront on which we are going to do a lot of the work of averting catastrophic climate change and reversing the worst effects of what has happened so far. And what do we begin with? We begin with the fact that if you ask anyone about the pathway to decarbonizing industry, it is firstly electrify everything and then green your electricity supply. It's not in a sequence, you do them at the same time. Now, one of the things that was said earlier, and Jonathan, who was on stage, made the point that renewable energy is actually really expensive to access in parts of Africa, and we tend to look at it from the perspective of energy poverty and how do we get 600 million households to have access to new energy. What we're missing, though, is that to deliver baseload renewable electricity, you know, you take an average, you know, let's take Germany versus a tropical country like Kenya. It costs 3 times as much to get the same amount of renewable electricity in Germany versus Kenya if you exclude the cost of capital. That's because you need a lot less photovoltaics, even if you're also accounting for wind. You need a lot less of it. We don't have winter. And secondly, you need a lot less storage to smooth out variations in supply. We don't have winter. What does that mean? It means that for any industry you're looking at that's going to need a lot of cheap electrons in the future, you need to put it as close to the tropics as you possibly can. That's where the cheapest electrons of planet Earth are going to be available. And that's true no matter how cheap solar panels get, because I don't care how many panels you can get for a certain amount of money, you can get twice as much energy from that same number of panels if you move them to my neighborhood, right? Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that there's a competition for jobs. It just means that you've suddenly got new places to put energy-intensive applications. It means that there's opportunities for different kinds of partnerships around those energy-intensive applications. Right? One example I like to use is today, if you want to decarbonize, say you wanted to decarbonize aluminum, Africa produces 25% of the world's bauxite, which is converted using electricity to aluminum. That conversion is worth about 1% of global industrial emissions today. If all you did was invest in African renewable energy to convert Africa's bauxite into aluminum, which can then feed into industry in Africa and in Europe, that's 1% of global emissions gone. and about 200 to 300,000 jobs, 300,000 direct jobs created, not to mention the massive transformation of the West African coast from dropping 44 gigawatts of renewables in there. That's a lot of financial engineering, a lot of technological work, a lot of partnerships with places in the world that have those types of capabilities. And that's the point. Converting Shenzhen from what it was to what it is created a lot of value in a lot of places, including the City of London. Unlocking Africa's potential to play that same role in the race to global zero offers the same scale of opportunities across a range of sectors.
So before we come back to some of the things that are going to be needed to make that happen, let's just stay with that picture of what's happening on the African continent, because when we think about the kind of economic activity that's going to be needed on the African continent to actually create jobs for the scale and size of the African young population, we're going to have to think, and I think this point was made by several speakers earlier, we're going to have to not be looking to the green sector itself to create those jobs. It's what we need to see this transition as a transformative economic activity in general, like transforming and building whole new economies. So I think what would be helpful, James, is again in that what's going to happen to 2050, is paint the picture for us about cities, about food, about economy in general, right? About what do you see this continent's going to look like? What's our Shenzhen in 2050?
Let's dig into food, also because it's almost lunchtime. So Africa is a net importer of food, massive net importer actually, but is also home to 60% of the world's remaining high potential undeveloped or uncultivated land. Africa also has a problem in that for a range of reasons, one, traditional fertilizer regimes don't work very well in Africa. They make our soils very acidic and don't give you as much yield. And secondly, farmers can't afford to use as much fertilizer. So you have very low yields per acre. And yet at the same time, we increasingly are recognizing that the green revolution that everyone else went through that was very chemical intensive has in some ways been a false turn. It has driven a huge chunk of global emissions today, and we kind of have to back that truck up and get to regenerative agriculture. Now, the interesting thing, and now I'll get really specific, is when you look at the role of regenerative methods, the role of organic methods of boosting productivity and so on, and how those interact with smallholder farmers, with tropical land masses and so on, you start to see a very interesting potential opportunity emerge, right? We're investing in a biochar fertilizer manufacturer, for example, that is able to match the performance of chemical fertilizer using domestically available organic ingredients recycled into the farm. Importantly, they're doing that while realizing a net carbon durable removal because they're putting biochar into the soil over time. So it's not just moving from being a net emitter in terms of the carbon cost of making fertilizer, it's turning agriculture and the process of fertilizing soils into a net sink. If you scale up that kind of opportunity, what you're doing is you're then saying to farmers, look, here's a way we can boost your incomes, firstly by making you carbon stewards, right? You're actually boosting your soil's ability to store and hold carbon. We're boosting your yields, and we're getting you started on a pathway that isn't dependent on the emissions-intensive agriculture of the past. And if you build that system out further and further, what you're then saying is you're moving away from our current global system where we make the fertilizer in one corner of the globe using fossil fuels and spread it all over, to one where we're actually creating self-contained agricultural ecosystems where the nutrients are just circulating. Where it gets really interesting is when you're able to say, well, yeah, you will need extra nitrogen and so on. Well, Africa can be the place, and we are seeing people begin to innovate where you can do things like distributed production of ammonia, right? Using solar power, green hydrogen, not to move around and export, but actually make it and use it on the land in a way that allows you with very little emissions to boost soil productivity, generate an actual desirable crop really embrace organic processes from the start and offer the world an interesting new alternative as a way to green our collective food supply. Now, the interesting thing is the more you do that stuff, the more it actually becomes more job intensive because you're creating more economic complexity in the communities, and you're role modeling stuff and you're testing technologies that will eventually, I think, become the way that we do all of these processes elsewhere. It just happens to be already cost competitive in Africa before it's cost competitive elsewhere. Now, some of that then speaks to some of the work, Nicola, that you've been doing around thinking about new sectors to prepare young people to enter into the workforce, where it's not just about saying, well, these are a few green sectors. It's about what's the green narrative in every sector, and how do we add that component of this is just how we do things into how we prepare our young people for employment.
So, I mean, when we look at that, whether it's agriculture and food systems, the built environment, I mean, you know, mega cities going to grow and need to be built on the African continent in the next 25 years. And again, returning to this audience, right? And we're sitting here in the UK, and we're focusing on a UK thinking about its growth strategy, its own transition, and its place in the world, and in facing into this climate challenge and next phase of economy. What do you see as I mean, people earlier spoke about there's clearly investment opportunity, something, you know, the UK is very, you know, good at, used to doing, in its comfort zone on, right? High-end and very sophisticated, you know, the high end of manufacturing was mentioned earlier rather than the sort of, you know, the general supply chains of manufacturing. When you think about the UK leading one in what its natural competitive advantages are in these transition moments, what Africa's comparative advantages and assets are, and the models we need, though, to unlock those, because somebody mentioned earlier that the terms of the financing don't work. The current terms of the financing don't work, right? The terms of trade don't work, right? And in fact, the way Europe's needing to approach it at the moment, not really looking very good, right? Because it's very protectionist and in fact going to make it incredibly hard for African economies to trade into products into Europe, because although they're very green, they're not going to meet the kinds of standards that they're green in other ways and very inclusive. They're not going to meet some of the standards that Europe is setting. So let's think about the UK-Africa partnership over this next, and what are the win-win kind of models that we can see, and what's it going to need to unlock those?
So I think there's partnerships in a few areas, right? So in addition to capital, there's technologies, right? If you're an innovator in, for example, green construction, we talked about the built environment. 40% of all new urban construction in the world between now and 2050 is going to be in Africa, right? In the same way that when you were talking about the future of cities in the 1980s, you may have been thinking that you were thinking about the next buildings to be built in Chicago, but you were really talking about Kuala Lumpur. You didn't know it at the time. The same today, right? You think about the future of cities today, you're really talking about what is going to happen, not to Lagos necessarily or Kinshasa, those are the big cities of now, but to Kisumu, to Kumasi, right? To all of these new cities that are going to be growing massively and will need new technologies, new materials, and so on going into them. So there's a technology opportunity for sure. I think there's also different kinds of industrial partnership, right? There's a whole question of diversifying supply chains. Well, part of the reason that global supply chains have such critical dependencies is much of the world's raw materials are extracted from various places in the world and processed in one set of very concentrated factories in one corner of the planet, right? What happens if you actually are thinking about investing in a more distributed supply chain that's using energy and raw materials where they are? It actually creates a more balanced kind of set of supply pathways for UK industry, while also creating the opportunities for interesting, two-way trade and correspondence. And then the last thing to my mind is, to what extent are there efficiency gains to be had, right? If I'm sitting in a temperate country and I need to electrify everything I'm doing right now, I'm going to need a lot more electricity than I currently have. And you look at the broader European equation, the United Kingdom is actually somewhat well off, but frankly, across Europe, there's a real question about an industrial system that was designed in an era when energy was easy to move in the form of fossil fuel, but IP and capital of other kinds was difficult to move because of unpredictable regimes of different kinds. We're in a different world now. Green energy is hard to move with any level of efficiency over great distances. Whereas knowledge, IP, expertise can actually move quite simply. So there's a whole set of knowledge partnerships that say, do stuff where the energy and the large labor forces and the raw materials are, and generate returns that will be abundant enough for everybody. Oh, and by the way, as a nice bonus, you reduce that pressure for people who are currently excluded from the global economy and just feeling the impacts of climate change to come here. Turn them into the workforce that's fighting climate change where they are in partnership with you.
James, and just, I think we can end there. With this idea of this generation of young Africans as part of the solution, not just a big problem to be solved, both in innovating and generating and being the workforce of this transition, alongside the kinds of work opportunities that Britons and people in the UK are seeking and going to benefit from in this transition. One of the, I think just in the picture that you paint there though, there is a risk again that we repeat patterns where, through mineral extraction and everything else, we sort of create another divide, which is somehow the ones in the UK are sort of white collar, the sophisticated, the tech jobs, and then there's kind of some other kind of supply chain that happens in a low sort of industrial economy in Africa. So share some of the innovation that you're seeing on the African continent that is also contributing to green tech, green innovation. I think we can end there because that's also where investment and partnership might happen, is in the social venture space that's burgeoning, I think, on the African continent.
So just to give you a sense, at the end of the day, talent is evenly distributed around the world. Opportunity often isn't. Interestingly, one of the things we're finding in our work, investing in early stage climate ventures, is because a lot of the verticals of new climate technology are relatively nascent today, the amount of ground you need to make up if you're trying to be at the frontier in, graduating from a Kenyan university is actually less than if you're in a sector where there's a lot of existing industrial complexity. I'll give 3 examples. I already talked about the folks that are doing really high quality biochar-based organic fertilizer, right? They're spending a lot of time actually figuring out the right types of organic ingredients to add to biochar to actually make it a full balanced fertilizer and deploying it. Entirely taking traditional knowledge, combining it with really world-class approaches to pyrolysis, the process of making biochar, to actually say, well, this product here is one of the best in the world. And why can I say that without fear of contradiction? Because they are a finalist in the Global Carbon Removal X Prize. They have a decent chance they're already one of 20 out of several hundred global technology companies that have made it that far and have a decent chance at winning. You talk about sectors like, for example, direct air carbon capture. Controversial to some, I know, because, hey, should we really be building machines to fix the problem instead of removing our emissions? The reality is we will need some kinds of engineered carbon removal solutions in addition to everything else we need to do. The interesting thing is one of the best teams in the world at making these machines right now, again, I can say this without fear of contradiction because of external validation, is a whole bunch of graduates of the University of Nairobi and the Jomo Kenyatta University of Technology who are working on the outskirts of Nairobi to make direct air carbon capture machines that are optimized to work with Kenya's big endowment of geothermal energy. So a way to kind of use that green energy for a global good, not mining Bitcoin, but actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere as a way to export renewable energy. And the examples continue, right? There's folks working on bioplastics from bio-waste and so on and so forth. So the minds are there. The partnership opportunities exist. And I think one of the other things that you see is once you begin to actually build up industrial complexity, people build expertise that allows them to take that forward, right? Taiwan used to be an inexpensive manufacturing destination that was just meant to copy what other people did very cheaply. Try and explain that to anyone trying to make a complex microchip today. There's just a process that we need to get on, and I'm saying across all of these new green verticals that will depend on latitude, geology, and to some extent demography, Africa is poised not just to be a part of the solution, but to be a pretty critical part of the global equation for net zero. And that's a huge investment opportunity and a huge partnership opportunity.
I see there's a question, so let's take that question. I'm winging it, Conduit team. I hope that's okay.
Hello. Is it on? All right, thank you. I had a question that sort of touches on a number of the different things that you've raised, like particularly around food systems and around some of the links between Europe and Africa. Because as it happens, like, you know, one of the biggest exports from, say, Botswana is beef, and it's specifically exported to the EU. And a whole lot of structural change has happened to make that possible. But obviously, cattle raising is not an environmentally friendly industry in many ways. And cattle play a large role also in a lot of traditional societies. So I'm just curious what you think could be done in that area in terms of obviously respecting the cultural significance of cattle, but also reducing the impact of that. And particularly in this case, it's the EU agreement which is driving the raising of cattle.
So there's a couple of things embedded there. The first one I'll take on is beef and cattle and so on, where I will say there's an aspect of this that just says, you know, as a species, we do need to eat less beef, period. But I'll also point out that to the extent that a unit of beef is being consumed anywhere in the world, a free-range African unit of beef is actually less carbon intensive than a feedlot-driven kind of global north unit of beef, just in terms of how you actually raise and manage the cattle. So there is a decarbonization story to be told there. Of course, the long term is a transition away in some ways. Although there's models like that of an organization called Mafisa in Zambia that's actually working at how do you use smart range management that's integrating both wildlife and cattle into restoring landscapes, into turning them to net carbon sinks. Because remember, herbivores are a part of our natural ecosystem. So can we actually go back to something that looks a lot more like a free-range natural system is one aspect of this. Another aspect of, though, is the unintended or sometimes intended consequences of poorly thought through climate-oriented legislation or trade legislation. We need to consistently value carbon in our trade systems and send the right demand and supply signals. Because what's happening today is there's no real gain to decarbonizing the way I do things as a farmer, and so I'm very carbon intensive in particular ways. If we did then say, let's consistently keep everyone on the same, you know, kind of benchmark in terms of the carbon intensity of production, the places in the world that use the least amount of fertilizer, have the largest amount of free-range tropical land, and will naturally become the spaces where we need to concentrate more agricultural production overall. But again, it's a journey, and there's a whole set of systemic issues that get in the way of it, including saying we're doing a climate regulation where actually we're just trying to protect local producers.
So I'm afraid we're out of time, and I don't want to be keeping you from any coffees or food that are in order. Hopefully, this has sparked some thinking on, you know, in every system and in every job loss, job creation, new innovation that is possible, how these interconnected systems economically and climatically and ecologically between Africa and the UK might be reimagined in this next phase, right? A positive shared prosperity future rather than any negative variants of that we may think about or carry as baggage from our past. And hopefully today has stimulated some thinking about what that positive path forward might look like. Thank you.